I am definitely saying that the end game of anti-Muslim racism is death itself.
Right.
Things like the hijab, things like the beard,
Yeah.
things like Muslim practice, prayer, so on and so forth, they racialize.
Going on about Islamophobia breeds a sense of victimhood.
The terrorist is outside of this rules-based order, therefore is stuck in the state of nature. There are certain lives that matter and certain lives that don't. Gaza has really made it clear without any shadow of a doubt that Muslim life, it simply doesn't matter. There's this image of a Christian Europe that is being invaded by the Muslim migrant.
Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism is a tool used by Muslims to avoid criticisms of Islam as a faith.
We know one of the representations of Muslim women, only knowable as a victim. She's a victim of Muslim misogyny, Islamic patriarchy, whatever you want to call it. To be anti-feminist is to be anti-civilizational. And we don't pay enough attention to the place of the hijab.
Islamophobia across the Western world is on the rise. It is a pernicious prejudice that seems to have seeped into public acceptance. It is just not the prize of the ultra-right across the West. Even liberal-minded governments have sought to malign Muslims unjustly. Consider President Macron's Separatism Act. It maligns in effect any believer that follows the shariah. Or consider at home the Labour government's reluctance to recognise anti-Muslim hatred as a cause of the most recent riots across northern England. Or the US administration downplaying the murder of Palestinians. My guest today, Dr. Amina Shareef, argues that Islamophobia is more than a visceral hatred. It is a death-dealing project. It aims to dehumanize and expose Muslim populations to death. Dr. Amina is an academic specializing in anti-Muslim racism, Islamophobia, and the war on terror policies, practices, and its impact upon Muslims. Dr. Amina Shareef, welcome back to The Thinking Muslim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you with us. And I think today's conversation is a really important one. We're just ending Islamophobia Awareness Month, and there's a lot of conversation in the press, or maybe less so, probably this year, about Islamophobia. Now, what struck me when we had a preliminary discussion about this subject is you define Islamophobia as a death-dealing project. What do you mean by this?
Yes. So this perspective is most certainly an unusual one, and it definitely needs unpacking, and it needs unpacking very slowly. And so I want to do it very concretely to begin with, right? So I want to do it by looking at what life for Muslims looks like, both in the UK and more broadly, right? So let's begin with the UK. We know that British Muslims face the highest levels of unemployment relative to their national counterparts. We know that if you have a Muslim-sounding name, you're 3 times less likely to receive an offer for an interview. We know that British Muslims face the highest reported levels of poor health for the age bracket above 50 years old. Right. Over half, or nearly half, of so 40 to 48% of Pakistani and Bengali women in this country have no qualifications at all. British Muslim women are 1.5 times more likely to not receive epidural pain relief during childbirth, 2.1% more likely to be in prolonged labor, and 2.4% more likely to experience postpartum hemorrhaging, right? The list goes on and on. I could give you many more statistics, but let's pause there and interpret them, okay? Yeah. One way to interpret these statistics would be to say that these statistics are evidence of Muslim exclusion from education, healthcare, health, and employment. Yeah. Another perspective or another approach would be to say these statistics are evidence of the slow death of a population, right? Because what happens when you are deprived from education, from employment, from health and healthcare, but slow death itself, right? And so this is a perspective that I take. And this perspective becomes a bit more compelling when you consider other metrics. The fact that British Muslims are subjected to death and injury on the street. They experience high levels of poverty, such as crowding in housing, and so on and so forth, right? Yeah. But let's look outside of the UK for a moment here to sort of consolidate this argument that I'm making. Let's take refugee deaths in the Mediterranean due to crossings, right? Between the years 2015 and 21, there were an estimated 20,000 refugee deaths in the Mediterranean. Many of them are Muslim. Let's take drone warfare. Between the years 2004 and 2018, there were an estimated 6,500 deaths due to targeted killing by drones. And we could say most of them were Muslim in the countries of Yemen, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Let's also look at refugee camps. There are refugee camps that house Syrian refugees in Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. There are almost 800,000 Syrian refugees languishing in these camps. That's nearly 1 million, living in conditions between life and death, right? And we could interpret what we have with these statistics is evidence of slow death and actual death for Muslim populations. And so this is why I say that anti-Muslim racism creates the conditions for the premature death of Muslim populations.
I mean, I find what you say there pretty interesting, very interesting, because you're linking what seems like a disparate set of statistics towards Muslims domestically and internationally. And are you arguing that they're all very much linked to a prejudice that has taken hold, and that prejudice is leading to the slow or the quick death, if we come to drone warfare, the quick death of Muslims? Is that your argument? Almost there's a conveyor belt here, and the end result is death. I
am definitely saying that the end game of anti-Muslim racism is death itself.
Right.
And sometimes what we do with our analysis of anti-Muslim racism or Islamophobia is we sort of look at the origin, right? We say, okay, it's rooted in prejudice, it's rooted in bias, it's expressed through discrimination. But what happens as a result of that, we're not necessarily telling that story. So what I'm saying is I'm taking exclusion from healthcare and health, education, and employment and saying, what is the consequence of all of that, right? And I'm drawing, of course, on theories that have been presented by, the Black tradition on racism, to say that, look, what we have is a situation where Muslim populations are facing, various forms of death, right, including physical death. Now, my approach to anti-Muslim racism recognizes that it's not just interpersonal, right? It's not just between a victim and a perpetrator on the street. It's not just between a victim and a perpetrator in a place of employment or in an educational setting. It's also between, Muslim people and states, right? Muslim people and policy institutions, legal regimes, state apparatuses, right? And so it's that personal and that interpersonal and that institutional sort of focus that I take when I do my analysis on anti-Muslim racism.
So you've used two words here, anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia. I know we spoke briefly about it in our previous discussion, but tell me if there is a difference between the two and why you use Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism as a way of explaining this phenomenon.
I prefer to use anti-Muslim racism, not because I think Islamophobia is not a valid term, right? We have all this debate and discussion about Islamophobia being insufficient or inadequate to describe what Muslims are facing today. Because we somehow think that we can sort of peer into the etymology of a word and say, this is what this word means for us now, right? But we don't do that for other words like carpet, for example. We're not looking into the etymology of that word and saying, this is therefore what it means, right? So we can't neither can we do that for Islamophobia and say Islam and phobia, and therefore it's a kind of fear with regards to Muslim people. That's not the approach that I take. So I want to emphasize that Islamophobia is a project. It's a racial project. It's a political project that's racial in character. And so to keep that emphasis on the racial character of Islamophobia, I use the term anti-Muslim racism. And then we'll get to later, perhaps, how I am approaching and understanding racism itself.
Well, let's maybe discuss. So I understand that the APPG, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, they prefer to use this term anti-Muslim racism as a way to describe this phenomenon. But in a sense, I mean, I've heard from critics of the APPG who argue that it doesn't go far enough, because what we're seeing here is a prejudice against a Muslim, not necessarily because of their race or racial characteristics, although that may be there, but actually it's because of their observance of Islam or what they perceive to be Islam.
Sure.
So, for example, the conversation we had last time about a young person wanting to conduct prayers in schools, wasn't that less about their color? I know that's not just what racism is, but it wasn't that less about their color and more about their Islam. So wouldn't Islamophobia in a way be a more adequate term?
That's a really important question, and I'm glad you raised it, because you are making reference to this very popular argument that we find across the political spectrum, right, center, and left. And it goes like this: Muslims are not a race, and therefore Islamophobia is not a form of racism. Now, this argument is based on an unspoken assumption. The assumption is that you have races, okay, people who are divided on the basis of some kind of external feature, whether that's hair texture, skin color, eye shape, lip size, skull size, so on and so forth. And then those races experience racism as a result. So what this assumption is doing is telling a chicken and egg story. It's saying that races came first, and then racism followed because of it. But what if we flipped the script? What if we said racism came first, and then races or racialized categories followed because of it, right? Because after all, that is what we did. We looked out onto the sea of human difference. And we tried to categorize this difference on the basis of external features, right? The hair color, the hair texture, the skin color, the eye shape that I just referred to. And then 2, we've tried to name these differences: white, black, brown, red, yellow. And then 3, we organize these differences or these categories on some hierarchy, with white being at the top, inferior, and brown, black, yellow, red, in some relation of inferiority. What I'm trying to say is that this process of racialization or racism created, right, these categories and then established the relationships between these categories. And so there's 2 competing stories here. Race came first and then racism followed, or racism came first and races followed. If we take the second story, then we can say anti-Muslim racism created the Muslim as a racial category. Anti-Muslim racism decided that there's something biologically essential to Muslimness. For example, a proclivity towards political violence, right? A penchant for misogyny, a propensity for irrationality and extremism, various other tendencies. So if we take that second story, which is that racism came first, and then because of that you have racialized groups, we can challenge this idea that Islamophobia is not a form of racism. And then we can begin to use the language of racism to talk about even religious discrimination.
Okay, so that's really, really well explained. I've never understood it like that. So Jazakallah khair for explaining it like that. Now, just to finish off the conversation, then, so imagine if a convert, a white convert, say, of course you can't be racist towards a white person, but imagine if a convert became Muslim and started to wear the hijab at work, and as a result faced prejudice from her boss or from her co-workers. Would that person be comfortable in defining themselves or defining the prejudice as a racial project or a project against a religious grouping? I hope you understand.
I'm not quite sure how that specific person would imagine their experiences. But as a researcher of anti-Muslim racism, I would say, regardless of the skin color of the person wearing the hijab, her experience is an experience of racism, because the processes that have meant that a racial meaning have been given to the hijab are the same processes of racialization that Black people experience, right? That other minoritized, racialized groups have experienced. Because that process is the same, then it makes sense then to call that experience racism. So
in effect, you're suggesting that now that this person has made a and move to become a Muslim, they're now othered. They're seen to be different to the host or to the majority population. And they're now seen to be part of the opponent's camp, or the camp that one needs to apply this level of prejudice to.
I think things like the hijab, things like the beard, things like Muslim practice, prayer, so on and so forth, they racialize, right? So it's not just, okay, so just before I mentioned that, external features were used historically to racialize groups. Hair color, hair texture, skin color, so on and so forth, right? Yeah. For Muslim people, because we come from all, colors, black, white, brown, red, yellow, for us, it's our Islamic practice that becomes the defining feature of our racial difference, right? And so let's just take the hijab here for a second. The hijab can be racialized. It can be given a racial meaning. In the same way skin color was given a racial meaning. Skin color was taken as an indicator of a racial difference, an indicator of some kind of biological difference in a black person. Yeah. And so if that same racial signification can be given to the hijab, then the wearer then sort of develops this racial alterity because of wearing it. And so the experience is deeply racial.
And what about the argument, so I do want to get to the, your major point, which is, Islamophobia is a death-defying project. And I think it's a really fascinating conversation to have. But what about the argument of some Muslims who suggest that going on about Islamophobia, in inverted commas, breeds a sense of victimhood? We know that there's prejudice out there. We know that there are people who dislike us, and we know that Islam features very strongly in this prejudice and our practice of Islam. But why do we need to even classify the idea of Islamophobia, like our parents who face very visceral anger on the street sometimes? They carried on and made a good life for themselves.
I think it's really important to do the work that, researchers and, think tanks and grassroots nonprofit organizations are doing around Islamophobia in terms of defining it first and then acting against it, right? Yeah. We cannot develop any kind of political policy, legal intervention against something that doesn't exist, that is amorphous, that has no definition. So what we're doing when we talk about Islamophobia is saying, look, there is a shared experience, right, that is lived by Muslims in the UK and more broadly. And this shared experience has a set of patterns. And these patterns, we're going to sort of intellectualize them. We're going to track their genealogies back to particular policies, back to particular histories, back to particular discourses. And in so doing, what we do is we create a picture about the political project that is racial in character that Muslims are experiencing. And then by doing so, we're able to strategize, right, come up with action plans, mobilize people, raise money. We can't do any of that unless we've done that preliminary groundwork of establishing what it is that we're fighting against.
You discuss drone warfare as part of this project of anti-Muslim racism or Islamophobia. What is it about drone warfare? And it's a tool of war. How do we make the link between this horrific way of killing people and Islamophobia? Explain that link to me, please.
Okay, so if I am coming with the argument that anti-Muslim racism exposes Muslim populations to premature death, then how is that facilitated? That's what we need to answer first to answer the question, how does drone warfare contribute to that? Okay. I think it's really important to take into account the war on terror and securitization when it comes to discussion of anti-Muslim racism. It is the political matrix. It is what gives meaning to anti-Muslim racism today, right? For me, that's the approach that I take. Securitization is critical in constructing Muslim life as killable life. Okay?
Explain securitization to you.
Right. So securitization is a process by which a particular population is deemed to be a threat, right? Very simply. There are other perspectives on that, but I think that's a good place to start. Now, let me explain this by looking at the figure of the terrorist, okay? The figure of the terrorist was constructed by terrorism discourses. Terrorism discourses are discourses that try to demarcate between legitimate violence and illegitimate violence, right? So legitimate violence is a violence of militaries, of intelligence agencies, of private security forces acting at the behest of state actors who are part of a rules-based order, okay? Illegitimate violence is violence that is enacted by non-state actors who are challenging the sovereign power and the imperial projects and the state violence of this category of violence, right? So in other words, illegitimate violence is made noble as terrorism, and its actors are made noble as terrorists. Now, the terrorist, it's important to note, is outside of this rules-based order, okay? It's outside of the rule of law, and therefore is stuck in the state of nature. What terrorism discourses are trying to say is that those who commit acts of terrorism do so out of some kind of ingrained biological penchant for committing irrational violence, right? What I'm trying to say is that the terrorist is a racialized category, okay? It's a category of a population that hasn't progressed into the rule of law for reasons that emerge at the intersection of biology and culture, okay? Now, what the figure of the terrorist does is that it allows an entire population to be securitized, right? And racialized as a threat. And to be racialized as killable, therefore. Why? What do we do when we have a threat? A threat, we know, needs to be eliminated, okay? And so securitization makes Muslim life kill the life. And it makes the death of Muslim populations not just normalized, but even necessary for the flourishing of a particular population that is deemed at risk from the threatening Muslim terrorist.
Yeah, well, that's really fascinating. But you know, we are led to believe that the rules-based order is meant to strip away this prejudice from essentially liberals who have coined this term. And so everyone in the world is meant to be treated equally. And states set up these international norms in order to make sure that people are not otherized and people do not feel that their community or their grouping is of lesser worth and lesser value. So I suppose and as I'm saying that, I know how hypocritical all of that sounds to all of us, but you know, how does one get away with that level of prejudice that you describe when you've got this world that's meant to have moved beyond, civilizationally at least, moved beyond this dark world that inhabited, you know, the sort of global space pre-modernity?
Really important question to ask in the context of the ongoing genocide in Gaza. My view on this is that, and this is a view that I share with other scholars of race and racism, which is that the law and the universals that are enshrined in law have a limit,
right?
Okay? And that limit stops at the limit of the human, right? What do I mean by that? I referred to it earlier. We looked at the sea of human difference, and we said, oh, these are humans, and these are animals, and this is another species, and so on and so forth, right? What is the limit of the human? It is a category of people that we wouldn't see as fully human, and that perhaps we would even dismiss them as animals. We've dehumanized them.
Right.
So this international order that we're talking about, it has an edge, and it stops at the limit of the human.
Wow.
And at the limit is populated by people who haven't been given, who haven't been deemed to, who aren't seen as having full personhood, right? And so therefore, they're not eligible for the protections and guarantees that are enshrined in international humanitarian law, for example. And that's why we continuously see violations of international humanitarian law, because these people were never considered applicable for the universals that are enshrined in law in the first place. They're outside of this juridical order. If we go back to your question on drone warfare, we can illustrate this, okay? Drone warfare, it emerged during the Bush administration and massively expanded during the Obama administration. And it emerged as an alternative to capturing and detaining suspected terrorists at the U.S. prison in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Now, the purpose of drone warfare is not to counter an attack, but to preempt the possibility of a potential threat from developing, right? In other words, it's a form of counterinsurgency in which death is the technique of power, okay? As the Obama drone doctrine stated, kill rather than capture. So there's this necropolitical logic here, which is kill them before they kill us, right? So drone warfare is all about killing, right? And it doesn't uphold international requirements, legal requirements, to make a distinction between combatants and civilians. Why? The kill radius, right, of a drone strike is 15 meters from the point of impact, right? So anybody within that kill zone is dead, essentially. These international requirements to observe the distinction between combatants and civilians is, in fact, dismissed by the US, which has redefined a legitimate target as any military-aged men within the kill zone, right? Which has enabled innocent people to be killed on the basis of guilty by association. And in fact, innocent people die all the time in drone warfare and drone strikes. And Obama's very first drone attack, drone strike, in 2009 killed 20 civilians after it mistook a Yemeni Bedouin village for a terrorist training camp, okay? Now, going back to our discussion, how is it possible for drone warfare to have persisted for all these years, right? Except if the international order accepted that it had a limit and that its legal jurisdiction didn't cover a particular category of people who were on the limit of what we count as fully human.
Right. And so that limit of what is and what isn't fully human, we can see that played out in, say, Ukraine, where the Russians do use drones against Ukrainian cities. But the uproar when there are civilian deaths is 100 times worse. Yes. It's more intense than any deaths in, say, Somalia or in Yemen or in Gaza today. Is that what you're saying? So in a sense, your basic argument is that European lives, or those who look very similar to Europeans, are far more valuable in their eyes than the lives of Muslims.
It's what the Black Lives Matter movement has been telling us for years now.
Yeah.
There are certain lives that matter and certain lives that don't. And right. Muslim lives don't matter within that calculation.
Okay.
We are seeing that play out on our screens now with the ongoing genocide in Gaza.
Yeah.
The biggest lesson that we are learning with this genocide is that Muslim life doesn't matter and that there is no international community that is going to guarantee its protection. We always knew this. We always knew this because we were seeing it in the case of the Rohingya. We were seeing this in the case of the abandonment of the Syrian people. We were seeing this in the detention of Uyghur Muslims, right? But Gaza has really made it clear now, without any shadow of a doubt, that Muslim life, it simply doesn't matter, right? It simply doesn't matter.
There may be some comments that we get. We get a lot of comments from non-Muslims who view our program, and some of them are faithful and some of them are not, like Muslims maybe, but there are some non-Muslims who will push back and say, well, fine, but you would never get this level of morality in any ideology. So Muslims would have a similar discernment. In the case of Muslims, it would be Muslims versus non-Muslims. So we would potentially, historically, see the lives of non-Muslims as lesser. Like, isn't this just sort of part and parcel of what it means to be a member of a civilization? Or would you argue that there is something different about Muslims and Islam when it comes to human life?
I think I would push back on the idea that within a Muslim majority context, we might value Muslim life over a non-Muslim life. But I don't think that's what you're saying anyway, right? I think there is very clear indication in our religious tradition or scriptural tradition that, you know, Allah has given dignity to all of humanity, right? And that dignity comes with the fitrah that He's put in us and that sacred purpose that He has given us, and, you know, this chance that He's given us to earn what we believe awaits those who believe and do good work towards the hereafter. we wouldn't necessarily reproduce. We wouldn't. I don't think a Muslim society would reproduce a white Western civilizational structure in a Muslim majority kind of political arrangement. Because if our arrangement, our political arrangement, leans on our sacred scripture, right, which has given dignity to human life, regardless of its belief in God or not, then we wouldn't do what they have done to us, right? I strongly believe that we would not do that. And I also believe that, you know, the oppress cannot become the oppressor, right? We cannot think that we are going to dismantle these systems of racism only to become racist ourselves, right? We are dismantling this system because we are bringing a new vision, right? A new vision to humanity in terms of how it should be arranged and how life chances should be distributed and how humanity should be valued. That's what the Muslim project on this earth is, right? It's about coming with this new vision. And so I strongly push back against people who would suggest we would do the same thing.
And refugees, we have seen large numbers of refugees over the last decade or just under a decade, many of them crossing the Mediterranean and many of them dying in the Mediterranean or in their journey through Europe or, of course, across the English Channel between France and the UK. And you argue that this is part of this project, also it's killing Muslim life. Explain this idea to me, please.
Right. So as you said, we know that refugees are taking irregular routes to migration because there are no legal routes made available. We know that they're crossing the Mediterranean on very unseaworthy vessels, right? Rubber boats and all sorts of vessels that simply cannot cross what the UN has defined to be one of the most dangerous migration routes, right? The central Mediterranean. And yet, what has been the response to refugee crossing of the Mediterranean? NGOs have launched search and rescue operations, right? Which means they go out and sea, they search the horizon, they find refugees, they bring them on board, they bring them safely to Europe. What has been the EU response to NGO search and rescue operations? It has been to contract search and rescue operational capabilities, right? In other words, stop NGOs from rescuing refugees at sea. How? By prosecuting NGOs on the basis of facilitating illegal immigration, by impounding and seizing NGO vessels, by fining crew members, in some cases up to 1 million euros, okay? By not allowing disembarkation at national ports, and also by not allowing rescue ships to enter waters where distress calls are likely to be found, right? So what we see here is EU policy, what is essentially EU policy to a refugee crisis, is an abandonment to death in the Mediterranean, right? And this is where I believe the abandonment to death and the killing of Muslim life becomes blurred. This distinction becomes blurred, right? How can you uphold the distinction between abandonment to death and killing a particular form of life? And so this is why I do think that EU response to migration across the Mediterranean has been a form of exposing Muslim life to death itself.
And how do we create, or how did they create the conditions of premature death?
Okay, so just to connect the two then. Securitization creates those conditions for refugees to be seen as, you know, disposable life, abandonable life, life that's killable. You can leave them to die at the sea because they're security threats, right? They are a threat to the flourishing of our nation, not just existentially, right? Demographically, because so we quote unquote outproduce our white female counterparts, but also because we come with this ideological difference, right? We come with Islam. And if you look at anti-migrant discourse, which is really anti-refugee discourse, there's this image of a Christian Europe that is being invaded, right, by the Muslim migrant, even though migrants can also come from different religious backgrounds, like Ukrainian refugees, right? There's this idea that migrants are Muslims. And our migration to Europe is this project of demographic jihad, of Islamization. We're seeking to supplant the white population, or a population defined through this imagined whiteness. And we want to replace also Western civilizational values, right? And so I think the securitization of Muslims, the threat that we pose, both existentially and ideologically, means that we can, as a nation, as a continent, essentially have a de facto policy that abandons Muslim life to death.
How widely do you feel this project has been embraced by society? I mean, of course, it seems like it's a political project, but it must have some level of credibility amongst populations. I mean, I do remember during the Brexit referendum, Nigel Farage had a poster behind him of a queue of refugees, and they're all Muslims from Syria. And, you know, it was very clear that was a dog whistle to Islamophobia. It was very clear that he was referring to the Muslim, you know, as you just described it, the Muslims are there, the Muslim hordes are here to conquer Europe. Yeah. How widely accepted do you feel that that project is within Western populations?
You know, here in the UK, I would say it's really institutionalized,
Really?
right? Just in the recent elections, I remember getting on my Twitter feed a election video made by the Labour Party, right? No, so it was the Conservative Party. And in this video, the video was about why Labour is bad for the UK, right?
Yeah.
And in this image, there was a beach, right? Probably Dover, where, you know, where channel crossing refugees land.
Yeah.
And there was like a red carpet that was rolled out, right? So this is a video made by the Conservative Party about a mainstream election. And it demonstrates, therefore, that anti-migrant discourse has taken hold of our political system at the very heart, and it's at the very heart of our political system, right?
Yeah.
Further evidence that this anti-migrant discourse, which is really anti-refugee discourse, I really don't like to call it anti-migrant discourse. Mm-hmm. Anti-refugee discourse was there in the Southport riots, the post-Southport riots, right? Yeah. Stop the boats. That was the chants that these far-right rioters were chanting as they committed all sorts of violence. In
my introduction, I suggested that it's not just the prize of the far right, but it's seeped into broader discourse, and especially, you know, when it comes to so-called allies of Muslims, you know, more liberal-minded or social democrats. Do you find that, and how do we observe that tendency across the political spectrum?
We see anti-refugee discourse in the fact that we have, as a UN response to the refugee crisis today, refugee camps. Okay, let me explain this.
Yeah.
Refugee camps are politically rationalized and popularly imagined as a humanitarian response to forced displacement. But the fact of the matter is that refugee camps are more or less in violation of international humanitarian law, right? State signatories have a requirement to offer refugees 3 options. 1, repatriation back to their home country. 2, asylum in a second country. Or 3, resettlement in a third country. But what we have are Syrian refugees trapped in these camps for protracted situations, right? 5 years is already considered a protracted situation, but in fact, many of these Syrian refugees are in these camps for upwards of 10 years now, right? Refugee camps are not meant to be permanent solutions. They're meant to be temporary stays, or transitory places of stay, okay? And they're highly securitized. They've got exit permits. They are regulated in terms of who can get in and who can get out, barbed wire, fencing, all of that. There's plenty of academic literature that has indicated that refugee camps are actually a form of containment, okay? Their purpose is to obstruct the movement of refugees towards the borders of wealthy nations where asylum claims can be made.
Yeah.
In other words, the purpose of a refugee camp is to warehouse unwanted refugee asylum claimants.
We don't
Okay.
see any Ukrainian refugee camps.
We see pathways being open for refugees to Ukrainian refugees to come legally into
Yeah.
the UK. We see action plans being made that aim to facilitate the integration of Ukrainians or Ukrainian refugees in society. So there is a marked difference here, right? But going back to this refugee camp, what you have is a situation of containment, right? Of Muslim refugees. Syrian refugees are essentially Muslim refugees.
Yes.
And this is a policy that's adopted. This is United Nations policy, right? And so going back to your question, to what extent is this anti-refugee discourse institutionalized? Well, the evidence is the fact that you can have these containment camps, which have genealogies, by the way, with prisoner of war camps, with concentration camps, with detention, with internment camps,
Yeah.
right? You have these kind of camps to warehouse some of the most vulnerable people who are escaping political conflict,
Yeah.
right? And that's policy. That's the strategy by which these people are being dealt with. And so that indicates the extent to which these anti-refugee discourses have become institutionalized.
How do we respond to many who fight back, who push back and argue that Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism is a tool used by Muslims to avoid any criticisms of Islam as a faith?
I say we welcome debate and discussion on Islam and Muslims.
Yeah.
Okay? I say bring your discussions about what's wrong with Islam from a philosophical perspective, from a scriptural perspective, from a theological perspective. But the fact of the matter is that most Islamophobes and those who churn out this kind of Islamophobic representation, they know very little about Islam and Muslims. And they come with these tired ideas and lazy ideas about who we are and what Islam is that isn't rooted in any kind of intellectual engagement with Islam. So that's what we have a problem with. Not with the intelligent discussion with Islam, but this approach that produces racializing images of Islam and Muslims that then exposes Muslim populations to premature death. And all of that masquerades as critique of religion,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's what we have a problem with. We have a problem when former UKIP counselor Eric Kitson, right? We know this tweet. It's a tweet in which there's a pig wearing a hat that says Allah on it, and he's spit roasting a Muslim over a fire that's fueled by the Quran. We have a problem with that kind of imagery, right? And we have a problem with the Crown Prosecution Services, which ruled that tweet was not incitement to religious hatred,
Wow.
right? And so a point on incitement to religious hatred, right?
Yes.
We have laws in the UK that adjudicate that. And we also have laws that protect the right to critique religion. In the UK, it's the Religious and Racial Hatred Act of 2006. Now, this act, it defined incitement to religious hatred as a new criminal offense.
Right.
And it was careful to protect the right to criticize religion. And so it defined incitement to religious hatred as any speech act or behavior that's threatening. And then the publication and circulation and displaying of written material that threatens, okay? So this act essentially prescribed a very narrow range of speech acts, right? Or behaviors that are both threatening and that are intended to incite to religious hatred, okay? What this act did, essentially, is that it made it virtually impossible to prosecute incitement to religious hatred. One, because it's very difficult to prove intent.
Yes.
And two, it failed to recognize that even if speech is not threatening and doesn't intend to stir up religious hatred, if it ridicules, for example, then it can racialize. And that racializing capacity exposes populations to violence, death and injury, premature death, right? If we take the example of Boris Johnson's comments about Muslim women who wear the niqab as being bank robbers and litter boxes, that might not be considered threatening, It might not have the intent to incite to religious hatred, but it certainly racializes. And we know that as soon as population is racialized, then violence becomes legitimate against them.
Let's talk about the Islamophobia and women in particular, or Muslim women in particular, because I do feel that it's a different variant of discrimination than men may be. I mean, talk me through that. Like, how do women face this discrimination, this Islamophobia?
I think Muslim women face the same conditions of premature death as Muslim men through misdistribution of employment, education, health, and healthcare opportunities and provisions, right?
Yeah.
However, I think Muslim women are more likely to face anti-Muslim racial violence on the street. We know that statistically. Muslim women are also more likely to be vulnerable to spiritual death because of legal moves to ban the hijab and other forms of Islamic trusts for Muslim women.
Yeah.
And we talked about spiritual death being the topic for another conversation. Muslim women, we tend to be visible as well. And so we bear the brunt of, social hostility and mistreatment and social isolation and so on and so forth. Now, I think what we understate is the importance of gender to the securitization of Muslim populations, right? Let me explain this. We know one of the representations of Muslim women is the representation of what Shireen Raza calls the imperiled Muslim woman. It's this Muslim woman who is only knowable as a victim, right? She's a victim of Muslim misogyny, Islamic patriarchy, whatever you want to call it. She's this victim of forced marriages, polygamous marriages, child marriages, terrorist marriages, right? Shamima Begum. She's a victim of FGM, honor killings, the whole 9 yards. But this image, the imperiled Muslim woman, she allows Islam and Muslim men to be constructed as anti-feminist, right? And this gender oppression that Muslim women supposedly face is crystallized on the hijab, such that it becomes a symbol of Islam's hatred for Muslim women. Now, in this age of so-called gender equality, in which the West sort of has designated itself as the flag bearer, to be anti-feminist is to be anti-civilizational. And so this gender dimension allows Islam to be situated, Islam and Muslim men to be situated in opposition to civilizational values, i.e. as an ideological threat. And so now that ideological threat that Islam and Muslims face or pose articulates with the existential threat that they pose, i.e. the threat of terrorism. And that together does the work. So the figure of the imperiled Muslim woman does the work of securitizing Muslim populations. And so gender is so incredibly central to this project of anti-Muslim racism. And I think we don't pay attention enough to it. And we don't pay enough attention to the place of the hijab and allowing all of that to happen in the first place.
And hence, the war in Afghanistan was coined as, or framed as, a war to save Muslim women.
Definitely.
That's really, really interesting.
Definitely.
So where do we go? Where do we go from here? I mean, it seems like someone watching this may feel that this is pretty hopeless. You know, we're now in a situation where this prejudice has seeped into everyday life. How do we as Muslims fight back? How do we respond to this all-pervasive anti-Muslim or racism or Islamophobia?
I think what is important to keep in mind is that what is at stake with anti-Muslim racism, as I'm defining it, as a project that exposes Muslim populations to premature death, is life itself.
Right.
That is what is at stake with anti-Muslim racism, life itself. So sometimes we say if we don't do anything to tackle Islamophobia, we won't be able to wear hijabs, we won't be able to eat halal meat, we won't be able to build our mosques. But I say if we do nothing about anti-Muslim racism, then we won't be even alive to worry about those things, okay? If we do not act, and if we do not act today, and if we do not act strategically, thinking about long-term change, then all that awaits us is death itself, okay? So what can we do? So while the situation looks grim, I there are plenty of grassroots, community-based movements that have taken up the gauntlet to challenge Islamophobia, right? And I think if you want to do something, just join one of them. For example, if you have legal expertise, join the Islamophobia Response Unit, which is a charity that seeks or that gives legal support to victims of anti-Muslim violence on the street. If you have leverage in your workplaces, then join Muslim-Friendly Employers, which is another organization that makes sure workplaces accommodate practices such as the hijab, prayer, Ramadan, Eid, Hajj, so on and so forth. If you have academic expertise, why not join the Community Policy Forum, which is a think tank that brings evidence-based research to policymaking when it concerns British Muslims. There's also Educate Against Islamophobia, right? And this is an educational intervention against Islamophobia. And if you're an educator or if you're a teacher, then you can be a part of bringing some of that material into classrooms, into other educational institutions to challenge some of the representational frameworks that drive this whole political project of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism. So there are plenty of ways to get involved. If there's a gap in what you see right now at the moment, then set up your own initiative. But I think what's important is to get involved, recognize that we have agency. We are not victims of Islamophobia. We should never adopt that framework. Okay, that has to be banished from our vocabulary, that word. Victim, we are not victims. We are here as stewards on this earth. God gave us a purpose, okay? And that purpose means that no matter what the political situation is, that we are going to strive and we have agency and we are going to disrupt those political conditions. That purpose is actually what is going to allow us to surmount any kind of political difficulty, because we recognize that purpose is with us no matter how bad it gets, right? And that purpose never changes. And so recognize that purpose and look around you, see what's being done, be involved, and the rest is to God.
With Dr. Amina Shareef, it's really been a wonderful conversation, and there's a lot there to unpack, and maybe we should have a further conversation, especially about the imperiled Muslim woman angle that you raised there, because I think that's really important in explaining a lot of how the West frames Muslims and Islam, and in particular their foreign policies. But Jazakallah khair, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.